Prince Edward and Sophie have just stepped into a conflict that feels impossible to reverse. And it is already sending shockwaves through the royal family. At the center of it all is Bagshot Park, a historic estate, and a tiara once gifted by Queen Elizabeth II to her most trusted daughter-in-law. But everything changed when Queen Camilla made a move that caught Edward completely off guard. This time, he did not stay silent. He brought in top lawyers and placed a legal file on the palace table, a file built over years, containing documents no one expected to see. What those papers revealed was something the palace never wanted exposed. So, how did it come to this? On March 25, 2026, a team of senior property lawyers walked into Crown Estate offices and delivered a file that represented years of quiet preparation. Inside were signed agreements, financial records, and proof of ownership that Edward had carefully secured over time. This was not a reaction. It was a strategy. At the center of the dispute was one critical question. How did the youngest son end up holding something the king believed could be taken back? To understand that, you have to go back to the final decisions made by Queen Elizabeth II before her death in September 2022. She had watched the monarchy evolve, seen tensions rise around power, money, and control, and she acted before it was too late. Her intentions were clear. The title of Duke of Edinburgh would go to Prince Edward. This was not symbolic. It was deliberate. That title had defined Prince Philip for decades, and Elizabeth ensured it would pass to the one son who remained steady, loyal, and free from scandal. In April 2023, King Charles III made it official. Edward became the Duke of Edinburgh. But the real story was never just about the title. It was about what came with it. Bagshot Park was more than a residence. It was the foundation of the role, a 120-room estate set within Windsor Great Park. And in her final years, Queen Elizabeth signed a letter of intent linking that estate directly to the Edinburgh title. That letter mattered. It was witnessed by Prince Philip in his final days, a clear signal that this arrangement was not meant to be undone. The title and the estate were meant to remain together. But after her passing, the situation began to shift. King Charles had long believed in a more modern monarchy, one where assets could be reviewed, restructured, and even reclaimed if necessary. By 2026, that belief had turned into action. There were internal reviews, financial audits, and quiet pressure placed on members of the royal family. And eventually, Bagshot Park became a target. For Edward, this was more than a disagreement. It was a direct challenge. He had waited his entire life for the title. And within a few years, the very system that granted it seemed ready to weaken it by removing the estate tied to it. Without Bagshot Park, the title loses its weight. It becomes symbolic, not functional. What makes this situation even more intense is what Edward invested into that property. When Bagshot Park was first offered to him, it was far from perfect. The building was outdated, neglected, and nearly repurposed into a commercial space. It had little value as a royal residence at the time. In 1998, Edward accepted a lease under strict conditions. He would pay a minimal rent, but in return, he had to fully restore the estate. And he did exactly that. He invested over £1 million of his own money, contributing significantly to renovations that eventually cost nearly £3 million. Once restored, his rent was adjusted to reflect market value. This was not a gift. It was an investment. And he went even further. In 2007, he secured a long-term position by extending the lease to 150 years through his company. That agreement gave him control, stability, and even the right to sell the lease if needed. Now fast forward to 2026. The property's value has risen dramatically, reaching an estimated £30 million. Suddenly, the estate is no longer just symbolic. It is financially significant. So when pressure began to build for Edward to give it up, the motivation did not appear purely administrative. There was a clear financial incentive behind it. And this is where Prince Philip's foresight becomes crucial. He had seen how the institution operated over decades. He understood how quickly positions could change once circumstances shifted. That is why he ensured the letter of intent was documented and witnessed. It was a form of protection. By the time this conflict reached its peak, Edward was not unprepared. The legal file presented in March 2026 was not created overnight. It was built piece by piece, designed specifically for a moment like this. Every agreement, every payment, every legal right was documented. So when the challenge finally came, Edward did not react emotionally. He responded with evidence. And now, the royal family finds itself facing a situation that is no longer private. Because once legal documents are placed on the table, the conversation changes. It is no longer about tradition. It becomes about rights, ownership, and power. And that is exactly why this moment matters so much. Because this is not just a family disagreement. It is a battle over control over legacy, and over who truly decides what belongs to whom inside one of the most powerful institutions in the world. The legal file delivered that morning rested on three powerful pillars. First, the original lease that proved Edward's personal financial investment. Second, the letter signed by Queen Elizabeth II and witnessed by Prince Philip, clearly linking Bagshot Park to the dukedom for his lifetime. And third, over 2 decades of records showing he maintained the estate at a level that actually saved the monarchy money. On paper, it was a strong defense. But there was still one problem. King Charles controlled the system. He did not need to break rules to apply pressure. He controlled the structure, and that meant he could make life inside the monarchy extremely difficult without ever crossing a legal line. So even with evidence in place, nothing was guaranteed. The fight had only just begun. Inside Buckingham Palace, as those documents were opened and examined, one truth became impossible to ignore. Elizabeth had made her decision. Edward had secured his position. Now the question was whether the king would respect it. But the conflict did not stay limited to land or titles. It quickly turned personal. Earlier in 2026, before the legal file was ever delivered, a quiet visit took place. A palace official arrived with a clipboard under instructions from Queen Camilla's office. It was described as a routine jewelry audit, framed as a standard heritage review. But in reality, it meant something very different. Someone had come to inspect and question jewelry that Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had worn as her own for over 2 decades. And at the center of that review was a single piece, the anthem tiara. This was not just another royal item. It had been created specifically for Sophie's wedding in 1999, commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II herself. Designed using antique elements from Queen Victoria's collection, it became the only tiara Sophie regularly wore for years. That detail mattered. Unlike other senior royals, Sophie was never given wide access to the grand state tiaras. Her position in the hierarchy was understood, even if never openly discussed. The anthem tiara became her defining piece. Take that away, and she is left with nothing of her own. Camilla's argument came wrapped in legal language, but carried a sharp message. Because the tiara included historic materials, it could be classified as crown property. That would mean it belonged in the royal vault, issued only when approved. The implication was clear. Sophie would no longer own what she wore on her wedding day. She would need permission to use it. That crossed a line. And more importantly, it created a dangerous precedent. If that logic held, it would not stop with one tiara. It could extend to countless personal gifts, given over decades, affecting multiple members of the family. Even Camilla's own collection could fall under the same argument. Edward's legal team saw the risk immediately. And there was history behind it. After Princess Diana's death, a necklace gifted to her was returned to the royal collection, only to later reappear in a redesigned form worn publicly. The backlash at the time was intense, and that memory never fully faded. Now, a similar pattern seemed to be unfolding again. But this time, Edward did not stay silent. His lawyers responded with a decisive document, a deed of gift signed by Queen Elizabeth II in 1999. It clearly stated that the tiara was a private wedding present. Not alone, not shared property, not held in trust. It belonged to Sophie. That was not the only signal Elizabeth had given. She had also awarded Sophie the Royal Victorian Order, a personal honor granted directly by the monarch. Together, These actions painted a clear picture of trust and intention. The audit was not just about jewelry. It was a challenge to that record. But Edward had already taken additional steps years earlier. Around the time of the wedding, he commissioned a matching set of pearl jewelry designed specifically to complement the tiara. While some materials were sourced through royal channels, Edward retained control over the design. That detail added another layer. His legal team argued that the tiara and the pearl set formed a unified artistic piece. Separating them would break that connection, strengthening his claim. And behind all the legal arguments was something far more personal. Sophie wore that tiara on her wedding day. Years later, during a formal event, she addressed Queen Elizabeth II in a way that revealed a deeper bond, calling her Mama in an unguarded moment. It was not planned, but it said everything. The woman who signed that deed was not just a monarch to her. And now, that connection was being challenged. By the afternoon of March 25, 2026, the situation reached a critical point. Edward's legal team issued a direct warning. If the claim on the tiara was not withdrawn, private letters written by Elizabeth would be made public. Those letters reportedly confirmed her intention that Sophie retain full ownership of her personal jewelry. And they carried even greater risk. They included references to Camilla. Releasing them would not just settle a legal argument. It would reopen old tensions, revive past perceptions, and potentially damage the carefully rebuilt public image of a queen. Years of effort could be undone in a single moment. By evening, the tiara remained with Sophie, but Edward took no chances. He had it secured under private protection, ensuring that no quiet review or reclassification could take place without confrontation. A clear line had been drawn. The legal battle was now fully visible. But what came next would go beyond law. Because when pressure like this builds inside the royal family, it rarely stays contained. And the next person to step in would shift the situation in a completely different direction. Princess Anne. They began seeing each other almost every day. And slowly, that distance between them disappeared. By the time of Elizabeth's funeral in September 2022, the change was clear. As they stood waiting for the coffin, Sophie quietly reached out and placed a hand on Anne's back. It was a small gesture, but it was real. It showed trust. And that moment mattered more than people realized. Because by March 2026, that quiet connection had turned into something stronger, something protective, something ready to act. So when Princess Anne walked into that meeting with King Charles III, she was not there as Edward's sister. She was there to defend what their mother had already decided. And she made that clear immediately. She told Charles that if he allowed this to continue, if he allowed private gifts from their mother to be questioned, reclassified, or taken back, then the word of a monarch would mean nothing. Then she delivered the line that stopped the room. If our mother's signature on a lease or a deed of gift is not worth the paper it's written on today, then your signature will be worth even less tomorrow. And wasn't just arguing, she was attacking the foundation. A king's authority only works if people trust what he signs. And that trust doesn't start with him. It comes from every monarch before him. Break that, and everything weakens. She had already reviewed the Bagshot Park documents herself. She knew exactly what Prince Edward had paid, what he had signed, and what the Crown Estate had accepted. The core of that agreement was simple. Edward holds a long-term legal lease over the property, backed by his own financial investment and binding terms that give him full rights to live there and control it within that lease. Anne's position was direct. Edward paid for that home. The Crown Estate accepted his money under those terms. That agreement stands. There is nothing left to argue. She didn't treat the tiara and the house as separate disputes. She made it clear they were the same fight. Both were things Queen Elizabeth II had personally given. Both were backed by signed documents. And both were now being challenged using the same logic. And made the point clearly. If they succeed in taking one, they open the door to take the other. And once that door is open, nothing Elizabeth signed is safe anymore. There was also a deeply personal side to this. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, lost her mother when she was young. Over time, Queen Elizabeth II became the closest thing she had to one, and understood exactly what that meant. She had lost her father in 2021, then her mother in 2022. She knows what it feels like when those connections are gone, and all that remains are the things they left behind. So when the tiara and the home were targeted, and didn't see paperwork, she saw something being taken from someone who had already lost enough. And there was another layer, and had seen this before. She was close to Princess Diana. She watched how Diana's position was slowly broken down. The removal of HRH, the isolation, the loss of support. She saw a woman give everything to the monarchy, and then get pushed aside. Now she was watching pressure build again. Different person, same pattern. This time, she wasn't going to stay quiet. Then she went further. She told Charles that if Camilla did not stop, she would act, not privately, but publicly. She would oversee a full audit of the Queen's household. Not just basic numbers, everything. Expenses, staffing, allocations tied directly to Queen Camilla. That threat landed hard, because and is the one person in the family who could actually make it happen, and be believed. She has a long record of discipline and financial control. When she says she will expose something, people listen. And she didn't stop there. She brought up Edward's children. There had been quiet pressure to push James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor into full private status earlier than planned, meaning they would lose their protected royal position, along with the security and support that comes with it, and shut that down immediately. She made it clear that decision belongs to their parents and to the children themselves, not to Queen Camilla. And this mattered to her for a reason, and chose a private life for her own children, Peter and Zara, years ago. But that was her choice. No one forced it. What she was seeing now was different. This was pressure, and she was not going to allow it. By the time the meeting ended, everything had changed. Charles was left with two options, both of them bad. He could back Camilla and risk breaking the credibility of his own authority, or he could step back and accept that some lines cannot be crossed. There was no clean way out. And as he walked out of that room, one thing was clear. This was no longer just Edward's fight. It had become a direct challenge to the king himself. The king was now caught between two fires. After reviewing the full dossier, King Charles III's own legal team delivered their conclusion. Prince Edward's position was virtually unbreakable. Every piece held. No royal order could override it. Charles had lost that fight. For years, he had operated on a belief that seemed obvious to him. As king, the one who granted the dukedom in April 2023, he believed he still controlled what came with it. The title, the property, the structure around it. His own lawyers told him, in writing, that he did not. What his mother gave Edward was not temporary. It was a legal inheritance, and it was completely out of his reach. That alone was enough to shake him. But something else in the file hit even harder. The letter witnessed by Philip. Charles knew his mother had always protected Edward and Sophie. He understood where her loyalty lay. But he did not know that Philip, in his final days, had formally backed that protection in writing. That detail changed everything. Because it meant this was not just Elizabeth's decision, it was both of them. And yet, even after all this, the pressure did not stop. Queen Camilla did not back down. Her position was clear. She wanted the same rules applied across the entire royal family. That meant reviewing private gifts like the tiara, tightening control over properties like Bagshot Park, and ensuring no one operated outside the system the palace was trying to enforce. She wanted everything brought under central control. And that is where the real problem began. Because Edward and Sophie were already operating outside that structure. They had their own secured home. They had proven they could function without depending fully on palace control. And that made them difficult to bring in line. So now, every move began to look like an attempt to pull them back under control by removing the very things that gave them independence. As a result, the situation inside the palace began to fracture. Staff started choosing sides. People who had worked around Sophie for years began quietly showing support for the Edinburgh household. At the same time, resentment toward the Queen's office began to spread. And where there are sides, there are leaks. Private discussions were no longer fully contained. Documents, notes, internal thinking. All of it sat closer to exposure than ever before. The palace, known for its control, was now divided from within. One insider put it simply: the king is being led into a minefield. He is being pushed to choose between his wife's demands and his mother's final decisions. There is no outcome that does not damage the family. That was the position Charles now faced. And outside the palace, the situation looked even worse. At a time when the public is dealing with rising costs and financial pressure, the image of a king trying to take a home from his brother, a home that brother paid to restore, would not be received well. It would not be forgiven. According to reports, Charles eventually stepped outside the legal process. He wrote a private note, a handwritten message sent directly to Bagshaw Park, asking for a family meeting. It was the move of someone who knew the law was not on his side. But the response made everything clear. Edward refused to meet unless his full legal team was present. That changed everything. This was no longer a family conversation. Edward was no longer acting as the younger brother trying to keep peace. He was acting as someone who understood exactly what was at risk and refused to give anything up without protection. And once that line is drawn, it does not go back. Charles had spent decades waiting to become king. Now he ruled over a monarchy smaller than it had ever been. But inside that smaller structure, something had broken. There was now suspicion, division, pressure. And somewhere in Surrey, inside a house he could not legally touch, the answer to whether his mother's final decisions would hold was no longer in his control. The defeat the palace had to put in writing. Late on March 25, 2026, a formal note was sent from the office of the Master of the Jewel House to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. It was short, direct, no emotion, no explanation. The anthem tiara would remain under her exclusive private control. That was it. No apology for the audit. No acknowledgement of the pressure. At the same time, the review of Bagshaw Park was quietly shut down. The official wording described it as recognition of the Edinburgh household's role in maintaining the estate. But inside the palace, no one misunderstood what had just happened. The crown had stepped back. Everything Prince Edward held was confirmed. The title, the home, the tiara, all of it remained exactly where Queen Elizabeth II had placed it. And that confirmation changed the entire balance inside the family. Because this was no longer a dispute. It was now a record. That note will sit in the archives long after everyone involved is gone. And when it is read in the future, its meaning will be clear. A claim was made. It failed. And the institution was forced to admit it in writing. But the outcome did not bring peace. It came with a cost that cannot be repaired. The relationship between King Charles III and Edward has changed completely. It is no longer personal. It is controlled, formal, limited to duty. What the public will see going forward is not the truth. They will see unity, appearances, two brothers standing side by side at events. But inside the family, everyone will know what is real. They will know that one of them had to use the law to protect himself from the other. And that does not go away. The structure of the monarchy has shifted because of it. There are now two clear centers of power. At Buckingham Palace, Charles and Queen Camilla continue pushing their vision of a controlled, streamlined monarchy. Away from that center, another group has formed. Princess Anne, Edward, Sophie, quietly supported by Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. They are not operating loudly, but they are holding a line, protecting what was built before, refusing to let it be rewritten. And that divide is now fixed. For James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor, this moment will not be forgotten. They watched their father fight without public drama, through documents, through preparation, through control, and he forced the system to step back. One day, James will carry the dukedom of Edinburgh, the same title his grandfather held for over 70 years. But he will carry it with a different understanding. He will know that the institution that gives can also try to take back. That knowledge changes everything. It does not create loyalty. It creates caution. And that will shape how he stands inside that system for the rest of his life. As for Charles, he has his monarchy, his structure, his authority. But what he no longer has is the full trust of a brother who stood quietly for decades, paid his own way, and asked for nothing except to keep what was given to him. That loss does not show on paper, but it will show over time, and long after the documents are filed and the silence settles. That is the part that will remain.